Welcome to Dungeon Brew, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about cities in our settlement series. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
Here at Dungeon Brew, we are about to release our first large crowdfunding project on BackerKit. It is Thagum. It is a new campaign setting manual that gives you a grim, dark steampunk world. Over 200 plus pages that's going to have new subclasses, new lineages, new weapons, gritty firearm mechanics, new feats, new monsters, city guides, and so much more. We are launching on September 9th, and we are looking for you just to go and follow the page right now and be ready for that launch. So follow the link, go check it out, and then come back to the video.
Hey everyone, we have already gone through a number of different types of settlements, all the way from roadhouses through towns, and we're getting ready to start getting into the biggest types of settlements that are available when you're trying to set up your world or try and set up your campaign. Today we're going to be talking about cities, which are kind of a step above and beyond what a town is. Joshua, could you start us off with a definition so that we know what we're dealing with here?
Yeah, we're getting a bit bigger now, looking at cities. This is where we're looking at settlements that have typically fewer than 25,000 people. They usually have several hundred structures or buildings that are put together. There's resources available across all levels of wealth and favor. Most industries are available within these locations. You have high mercantile options, you have entertainment, you have religious and military facilities are well established. Typically when I have my players or their characters going through cities, they can find just about anything in these locations. Sometimes there might be items that we're going to roll for if they're really rare, but all your uncommon, your common items, and even some specialty items can be found within these locations.
Right. And I do want to point out, because this might be a little bit confusing, that there's another size beyond this, right? There's the metropolis, which we'll talk about specifically in the next video, but because traditionally in medieval settings, cities didn't get very big, what we're trying to do is we're trying to separate out those massive cities that were very, very rare. So when we're talking about a city, we're talking about usually something that is like there's a couple of these per country at most, usually between like 1 and 3. If you have a really big, prosperous country, they might have 3 cities in them. But oftentimes the only city in many countries would be the capital city, and that would be where the group would be gravitating toward, or they would be traveling toward, because it is the city. It is the capital for whatever country you happen to be navigating through.
Yeah, in many cases, it's the largest settlement you're going to have in the region, and the adventurers are never going to see that metropolis level.
Yeah, and the metropolis level may not even exist in your world, depending on your world population and things like that. And like I said, we will get into the specifics of the metropolis in the next video, but I did want to provide some context there, just because there might be a little bit of confusion of going, wait, what's bigger than a city when we're talking about medieval city sizes or settlement sizes, and that's kind of that explanation.
Go
ahead. No.
I was just going to say, I'm just going to dive right in terms of like when I'm building cities from a GM perspective. Like, I'll be honest, the first thing that I look at in building that city is all about the mood. Because cities have such a different flavor to them when your party comes into them, and they expect something more when they come into a city environment. I think that's probably true even when I'm reading a fantasy novel and my characters are leading up to getting into that big city. Man, I'm ready for the description, the tall towers, the battlements, the walls that are surrounding the towers on the edges, the crier on the corner, the taverns, the people moving about their daily business, trade going on. Like, I expect to see all sorts of diversity and conflictual like images as I'm stepping into that city. So I know for myself, when I'm thinking about building cities for my players, I'm thinking about what type of things are going to make this place stand out in a way that's different or unique to any place they've traveled to before.
My favorite example of this is Robert Jordan when he describes cities, because there are a number of very large cities in his writings, and each city is unique. And if you want some inspiration for how to differentiate city A from city B from city C, look at the way that he describes the cities the first time that a character comes into it. You have something like Carrion, which for me is fascinating because they're this uptight people who are very rigid in the way that they construct things. There's a bunch of square towers and square buildings. All of their roads are lined out on grids all the way through the entire city. And so if you're in the city proper, it has a much different feel than other cities you might come across throughout his world. But the interesting thing about it is that they're also very elitist. And so all of the poor people that live in that city live outside the walls in these like shacks and huts. And it's just this maze that you have to try and navigate through, and everything's ramshackled and broken down. And it's a very different feel going into a city like that versus Tarvalin, where everything was made by the Ogier, and there's these intricate carved vines, and all the stone flows together. I don't want to go through every single city in his works, but the mood, just based off of the architecture, the construction, the division of labor, or the division of populations in a city like that, all of those things can feed into the theme and to the mood that make it very unique and exciting to actually come across.
Yeah, I would agree. Everyone needs to take off like 3 years and just go read the Wheel of Time series so they can understand how to build good cities.
You don't have to read the whole series, but you could read the city descriptions at the very least, which shouldn't take 3 years, I hope.
No, I would hope not. It's just finding those. I don't know if they have those separated out somewhere online. But you're right. The layout of how you structure these buildings is super important to cities outside of other locations you may have previously went to. When you're looking at hamlets or villages, they're kind of throwing up buildings where they have space for them, where they can put them at to kind of expand out without a whole lot of rhyme or reason sometimes. But a city is very technical, strategic in the way that they put up these buildings. I need my barracks in a certain location. I need my armory in a certain location. If I have my city built against a cliffside or against a river, I have to have my city built in such a way that I can access resource, increase trade, get food and supplies to my citizens. If I'm in a time of war, what's our escape routes look like? There's all sorts of things you have to consider in the construction of a city that you may not be considering in the development of other settlements. So
right.
That layout
and it also depends on the history of the city, right? So some cities might be very strategic in the way they put things together, and other ones, they grew too fast. They didn't have time for those considerations. It's poorly laid out. There's these narrow streets that it's like they dead end in places where somebody decided to put up a house or a building. And it's like you go down a street and realize you can't get out that direction. You have to turn around and go back the way you came. There's a bunch of different varieties for the way that you can do that type of stuff. It's also, with the campaign I'm running currently, when you guys entered into, Gazad for the first time, that there was a description that I provided for that as well. You're going into a dwarven city. It's got these massive caverns, and you have to realize that dwarves are accustomed to the darkness, the low light. There's not a lot of light sources around, and many of you were human or otherwise who come into the city, and it's this massive expanse of darkness where you just see glimmers of light off in the distance, and you don't really have a grasp of the size or the layout of the city because it wasn't designed for you. And that could be true of any time that you go into a city that is occupied by a different type of people who go, this city was designed for our people, for our purposes. We're not building doorways that can accommodate a 6.5 foot tall orc. We're dwarves. Why do we need doorways that tall? You'll be ducking every doorway that you go through, which is the same thing that you find in like Hobbiton in the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, is that, the doors and the buildings and everything are built for hobbits. They're not built for people.
Yeah, I love that type of specificity when it comes to cities and how you're building it, and remembering those things as you're having your players kind of travel through, because it kind of immerses them or submerges them into that world. It makes it more realistic for them. I know one of the things I always have to wrap my head around when I'm building cities is how cities were built in medieval times or even antediluvian times prior to how they're built in modern times. Because when I think of a modern city, I'm thinking of your central districts, and then usually your inner city, and then you have the suburbs where you oftentimes see the wealthier classes live. But in cities, you usually have your stronghold in the center with your wealthier classes or districts. And then outside the city walls, like you mentioned, is where you have your farms and your people that don't necessarily have the same coinage. And so it's almost like an inversion of what we see in the modern times when you're building these cities.
Right. Well, and you have recent times where people have gone through and they've started to revitalize those inner city portions of it. So you have a influx of a wealthier population going towards the center of the city again. But I do like that. And I think it's important to realize at this stage of building, you get maybe a little bit of this when you're building a town, where it's like you have districts and you have things divided. And we talked about this where the wealthier inhabitants are going to live in certain parts of the town and the poorer inhabitants will live in other parts of the town. And then you'll have, you'll have separations based off of maybe their culture or their history or something like that, where you have refugees who come from a certain location and they populate a certain district in the city. This is something that I do when I get into city building, is that I actually start to create boroughs. I create districts. I create segments for this size, because they're almost like smaller towns or smaller villages located within a larger settlement, and understanding what is located in that district is important. I mentioned Gazad as the dwarven city they built. Dwarves are very organized. They're very practical. When they build their city, they build it for, these are where the people live. These are where the people work. These are where the people trade. These are where the people go and, execute government. They're very deliberate about the way that they organize their city. You're not going to find the same thing if you're going into a human city. You're going to have boroughs, but those boroughs may not necessarily be designed for that purpose. They may have just taken on a purpose as a result of the passage of time and its use.
Yeah, I find this stuff extremely fascinating. I know that we've played in my Hawkhurst campaign regularly, which is a massive city that I built. It might be a metropolis, so maybe in that sense it doesn't fit. But where it does fit is the districts and the bureaus that have been built there. And this kind of ties into the government system that I have set there, where there is a king that oversees things, but every district is ran by a family. Every family has an industry or a trade within their district that provides for the city, that brings in their wealth. And it's kind of broken down into this smaller system of governance that's overseen by a larger government, which is kind of unique to that particular setting. But it is something you need to consider in building these cities on what type of government do you have set up. Is it a monarchy? Is it a republic that's put together? Are there counselors that oversee different bureaus that come together and then talk about the issues in their specific bureaus and need, reinforcements from other ones? Almost like there's inner trade within the city or inner dealings within the city. So considering how you want to set up that government is really going to give a lot of the flavor of how things are going to function while your characters are exploring the place.
And it may depend on the size of the city too, because we mentioned like the upper limit for this type of settlement is about 25,000, but that doesn't mean that you can't have a city that has 8,000 people in it, which is much smaller. If this is the capital city, or if this is the city where the seat of power is, they may actually be in charge of running the city as a whole. They may not actually have anybody else who takes control of what's going on in the city. At the same time, if you've got a monarch who is in power, they may actually be appointing people to take care of various parts of the city or various aspects of the city in the same way that we do in our own society. They may have a mayor, they may have magistrates, they may have various forces that control various districts and that type of thing. It really kind of depends on the way that you want that to come forward in terms of the power of the government, the organization of the government, and what role the leaders in that city have when it comes to the way that things are run.
And I don't know about you, but I typically think that in cities this size, you always say follow the money trail. Even when it comes to government, that's what I'm thinking too. Because with most things, we talked about a lot of this, I think, in detail around towns. But when you come to cities, everything is magnified. Your money's magnified, your industries are magnified, your entertainment's magnified, your corruption's magnified. You're essentially putting a magnifying glass on each one of those and expanding them outward because there's so much more opportunity for all of them to exist.
Right. The wealth disparity is massive, and it's more pronounced between the aristocracy or whoever happens to be in power versus the merchant classes who are in charge of trading and that type of thing. But even within the merchant class, so not even within the merchant profession, you have very poor merchants who are, trading in day-to-day goods that the peasants and the serfs are purchasing. And you also have merchants who are trading in exotic luxury goods that they're trading to nobility who are purchasing it from them. And as a result, those merchants are massively wealthy, potentially even more wealthy than some of the more powerful people in the city because of the type of trade that they do. And I think that it's important to realize that type of, disparity and that type of creation within the city creates a very unique tapestry for the way that interactions occur. Because then you end up with those kind of classic tales of the merchant who is trying to get into a higher status by marrying his daughter off into a noble family because he's got the wealth that noble family needs. And that's where that type of thing comes from.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. Also with these merchants is recognizing how they're conducting their business within the city. I think of the multiple ways you see this presented in Forgotten Realms or within like even the Baldur's Gate games where merchants are outside the city with their tent and they have their own protection, or in the city with maybe hired guards that's protecting their gear and the things that they have. Like there's multiple ways that you can present this to kind of show their status and how they're represented within that region.
Right. So I feel like we've been talking about a lot of things that I think are very important to cities in general, but there are several things that I do want to touch on.
Sure.
We talked a little bit about demographics and population. And I've mentioned this before in previous videos, but I do want to take a stab at it here as well, which is that the population of the city is limited by the food resources that the city is able to procure. So it makes more sense that a city that is located on a coastal region is going to have more access to food than a city that is located on top of a mountain. So keep this stuff in mind. This is the Mordor effect. Where is the food coming from? How is the population able to be supported? And this is very important if you get into events or story events in your campaign, such as famine or war, where it's difficult to come by food and get it into the city. What happens in those instances? You can look at Paris during the turn of the 18th century, if you're interested in this, with the rebellion and that type of thing, where they didn't have food and they were at war, and there was all kinds of pestilence, and the peasant classes were starving because they didn't have access to food. That type of thing is very interesting in this type of location. In the same vein, keep in mind things like disease and plague in a city location is extremely dangerous. It's the type of thing that can occur obviously in a hamlet or a village or wherever, but the greater the population, the greater propensity for that to get out of control quickly. And in terms of story management, this is something that you should be keeping track of and paying attention to, because at some point in time, there is always some kind of famine. There's always some kind of plague. There is always something going on in a city like this, because so many people are living so closely, and the ability to maintain hygiene in this era is much more difficult than it is nowadays.
Even nowadays, there are some concerns about people's hygiene. No, I would agree with you. Yeah, the thing that sticks out to me most is about the food thing, which I know you and I talk about a lot, but I can remember how many, not only stories I've read, but ttrpg games that I've played where I arrive to large cities and they're on a plains and there's no farmers.
Yeah.
Like that there's just no farms outside. It's just like there's just walls and you walk in and there's all these trade shops and places to go to and places to experience, but it's like there was never any sign of anyone growing food outside of that city or that city state, which is always fascinating to me.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's, and like I said, I think we talked about this again in towns and even larger villages, but as the population grows, the number, like there's this exponential growth of the number of farms needed to feed these people, because many of the people in the city are not producing food, which means that you have to rely on other people to produce enough food, to have excess, to bring it into the city to feed the people who are living in the city. So as you're approaching the city, it's like you kind of end up with this. There's little hamlets that produce food, and then larger villages, and then towns, because they get bigger as they go towards the city, because they're all producing more. They're larger farms, and there's more food, and there's more money. So all of that stuff gets funneled towards the city. And like I said, coastal regions make a lot of sense, because then you have fish. And that creates such a huge supply of food for a city that does not rely on the seasons necessarily quite as much for them to be able to access that bounty by just going out into a ship with a net and getting some fish and bringing it back into the city.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure how much time you want to spend anymore on like mercantile trade and industry stuff. I think we kind of hit it pretty well.
I think we talked about it a lot in the previous videos.
It kind of is the same. Yeah, I was going to say, if you really want some more information, I think the town video covers that more. And that's just, again, just the same thing in the city with a magnifying glass on it.
Right. And like I think we mentioned, luxury goods, exotic goods, these things are easy to find. If you're in favor of things like a magic shop, sure, you're going to find that in a city. You might find one in a town, but in the city, you're actually going to have some of that. And something else I think we mentioned in the town video was the thing like rare types of industry are going to occur here, which means there are rare types of shops, but there's also multiplicity of those. Larger cities are going to have Bookman's Row, where they're all binding books, or, the people who are very good at sewing silk and they're in competition with one another to get the attention of the aristocracy so that they can sell their supplies. That is going to be more common in the city.
So the thing that I think that I really do want to talk a little bit about with you in regards to cities is the entertainment industry, because I do think this takes another level when you get into the city area. I mean, we always think of entertainment as, your bards and the people singing, but when you get into a city, for me, you're now getting into festivals, you're getting into large religious experiences that are taking place. I know this sounds terrible, but there's entertainment like the guillotine or public hangings that are taking place. Yeah. You might have, and depending on the time frame, you might even have like a library and other establishments like that people can go experience to have kind of their own entertainment. So once you get to
the Library of Alexandria was 2,000 plus years old, so it's not unheard of almost in any period of time to have something like that. It really comes down to the culture, the theme, the mood, those things that we talked about at the beginning of the video, I think.
And that's exactly what I wanted to tie it into, is that these things really speak to that mood. You have to understand a little bit about your mythology, your cosmos, your festivals, your calendar year, and all those things, and what those time periods mean to your citizens within this location.
Right. And talking about this makes me think again about, because we were talking about it, with the Wheel of Time and the Carrion People, that they have, one of the books, they describe how there is a festival that occurs and all these uptight, rigid people, suddenly they just kind of let themselves go because it's that specific festival every year where you're basically allowed, like, no judgment, do whatever you want. It's like this Mardi Gras in the middle of the city, and everybody is having sex in the streets and doing all this crazy stuff, whereas the rest of the year they're all buttoned up and it's like they don't flinch and they don't talk and they never show emotion. And I find that very fascinating for that change, that abrupt shift in the way that their mood is, and because it's a cultural thing that it's appropriate to do it at this certain period of time. It's almost like the Purge, but not murder. So that's kind of, but I think that you're right. Like in terms of festivals, you get a better mood for what the city is about in these types of situations. And it's always entertaining to bring your adventuring party or bring your group into a city during a time of festival. What is the festival for? What is it about? Who are they worshiping? What is it? Those types of things I think can add a great deal of vibrancy to not only the campaign, but the city as a whole, for them to get a sense of what's going on.
I'm sorry. I'm so much imagining, like, the day your party shows up is the sex festival. And so it's just like they come in, everyone's dancing in the streets and whatever. It's just a wild time. And then they wake up the next morning, everyone's buttered up like nothing's ever happened.
Yeah, we don't talk about that.
we don't talk about winter solstice. Yeah, that's great.
No.
So other things that we probably need to wrap up here around the cities. Military is going to be prominent, I think, in the city. At this point, you're going to have probably a military establishment, like I mentioned earlier, a barracks of some kind, a head of a guard, a marshal. You may have some trainings grounds for, your knights or your swordsmen or your archers, where there's actually some individuals that are dedicated soldiers that either work for the king or are some sort of militia within the city that are getting regular training that's taking place. Not to mention the town guard that we mentioned before.
Right. And the town guard, after we talked about this in the last video, it made me think a little bit, and I wanted to look more into it. And what I found was pretty interesting just in terms of like the way the town guard operates. So it wasn't historically the town guard, we'll just call it that because I think that's the fantasy equivalent, was more of just a night watch. So the town guard was mostly responsible for keeping the peace at night. Like from the hours of like 8 p.m. until 6 a.m., they had a night watch. They walked the streets. They make sure there was no crime. They make sure that no enemies were coming to attack them in the middle of the night. They made sure that the roads were safe, that type of thing. That was pretty much what the town guard did. They didn't do a whole lot during the day necessarily because most of their job was keeping the peace at night from would-be troublemakers. So I think at a minimum, backtracking here a little bit in some of the other videos we've talked about this makes sense in things like villages, potentially towns, definitely in cities this would be the case because you would have your lantern lighters coming through the streets and lighting all the lanterns on the roads, and then you would have your night watch keeping track along the walls and along the streets to make sure that there's no crime and everything is peaceful during those periods of time. And then you mentioned military, and that's an entire other kettle of fish because then we're talking about is there a standing army? If there's a standing army, how many are there? What are their responsibilities? Because they may have training grounds. They may have some of those stuff, but there's some of those things. But depending on the time, are we in a time of war? Maybe they're not actually fielding armies. Maybe they're not that worried about it. There are no tensions. So they don't actually have a whole lot of military presence in or out of the city. But as soon as tensions start to rise with your neighboring country or something like that, then you see this ramp up and they have those facilities if they need them.
And it probably has a lot to do, too, with the level of corruption that you have in your city. How the government perceives that corruption. But if there are high levels of corruption, you might have individuals, maybe not hiring a town guard, so to speak, unless that your rulership or your government is doing that. But you might have businesses and establishes personally hiring people to keep their things safe.
Right. And corruption should be on another level at this stage, too, I would think. This is where your full-blown thieves guilds are, that type of thing, warring factions. And again, like you said, it depends on the city, depends on the mood, depends on those things. But the possibility of that makes more sense in a large city where they can be largely undetected in the crowds. It's more difficult to locate the hidden base with all of the nefarious individuals who are coming in at night to burglarize you than it is in a hamlet where there are 48 people and 6 of them wear red sashes. I mean, you know who they are. That's not an issue. Yeah. The city is a completely different thing in that regard.
It kind of strikes me as we're talking about this, and even in looking at the previous videos that you've done, that you and I are kind of presenting a very realistic formation of how to build these, and don't necessarily mirror what you might find in like a high fantasy setting or some sort of alternative fantasy setting. Because in some of those, you might have the full-fledged assassins guilds and thieves guilds and town guards and all of these things to kind of really give this fantastical atmosphere, but it may not reflect what is historically accurate, which I think is what you and I are talking more about.
Right, which, now that you mention that, I mean, that's my default whenever I start working on anything like this, is I go, what is reality? And then I choose to break reality after I figured out what reality is.
Yeah, I think you gave that disclaimer on the Roadhouse video, but
yeah.
Just to reiterate.
No, it's a good point, because you can definitely get away with other options. We're talking about like realistic populations, realistic food, that type of thing. Magic always makes that possible to be different. You can have a city of 250,000 if you want to. If you got the magic that can support it and your world makes sense with it. This I think we're trying to base this in some sort of reality, and then you can build off from there.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's all I have on cities. Any last comments, John, before we send them on their way?
I don't think so. That should be everything. And then we'll wrap this up in the next one with metropolises.
All right. Thanks so much for hanging out. Click the subscribe button and that little bell, and we will see you guys next time.
Dungeon Brew.